And the situation is bad for Kiev on the battlefield when the mainstream media in the West start to acknowledge it. This comes, of course, as you have Russia reporting that Russian forces have encircled more than 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers in key points along the front lines. So what does this mean for the overall conflict, and where are things headed as you have Russia also rolling out groundbreaking technology, of which NATO has nothing that compares? Well, we got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Scott Ritter, a former UN weapons inspector and U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer. Scott, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here. I know it's being reported that Russia is closing in on Pokrovsk, with officials reporting Russian forces have around 5,500 Ukrainian soldiers encircled. Now, even mainstream media outlets here in the West are starting to admit that the situation is bad for Kiev and that Pokrovsk is a key and transport hub that will disrupt supply lines, yes, but also give Russia access to Kiev's last remaining strongholds in the region. So how do you view the current situation surrounding Pokrovsk and what it means for the war overall?
Well, I mean, it's reflective of the trend. The trend is that Russia retains strategic initiative throughout the entire line of contact, and that Russia has focused its resources on particular points that will degrade Ukraine's defensive posture and put Russia in a more favorable position to continue the offensive. Russia is not looking for a ceasefire. Any ceasefire that occurs must occur in concert with Ukraine acknowledging the legitimacy and the inevitability of Russia's stated goals and objectives, especially when it comes to territory. So the Ukrainians can either give up territory and save lives, or lose territory and lose lives. And what we're seeing in Pokrovsk is that if Ukraine wants to fight, Russia will give them the fight. And right now in Pokrovsk, I believe up in Kupyansk, further north, Kupyansk, there's 5,000 Ukrainian soldiers in danger of being encircled or encircled. And in Pokrovsk, it's 5,500. Whether this is a classic, encirclement where the Russians have, troops 360 degrees around, or is this an encirclement where Russia has taken key terrain features and controls, any potential exits with, overwatch and fire, meaning that if the Ukrainians attempt to break out, they'll be killed, and it's a de facto encirclement? We don't know. There's reports that suggest it's not a complete encirclement. Even the Russians acknowledge that, they may not have full 360-degree control, but that their ability to bring fire down, observed fire down on Ukrainians in short notice, gives them the equivalency of encirclement. But this is a bad thing for the Ukrainians. It's not just Pokrovsk and Kupyansk, though. If you go up and down the battlefield, people, I always love it when, the armchair warriors that are out there, the Russians aren't advancing. They're advancing little pieces here, there, and everywhere. And I'm like, yeah, it's still an advance, but it is a war of attrition. And Russia has goals and objectives that are geared around terminating Ukrainian life, the military life. That's how you win a war of attrition. And what Russia's done, if you look at Pokrovsk, basically the Ukrainians dig in and the Russians compel them by making a move on a position of importance. The Ukrainians dig in, reinforce, make it very difficult to take with a direct assault. And then the Russians begin to envelop, come in from the left and the right, and they create these pincers that come around. And next thing you know, the Ukrainians are in danger of being encircled. We've seen this over and over again, where the Ukrainians then have to retreat. What's happened here is that the Russians have closed off the retreat. So the Russians are making a decision now that they're going to finish the job. These 5,500 Ukrainians aren't going back into the fight. And up and down the front, you'll see little mini encirclements taking place all over the place. We're talking about, it's about 10,500 between Kupyansk and Pokrovsk, but overall, the number of Ukrainian troops that are in danger of encirclement is around 50,000. troops. Now, most of these will probably withdraw, but as they withdraw, understand they will be subjected to fire, and you can assess that 20 to 30% of these will become casualties, either dead or wounded, taken out of the fight. So, you were talking, 20,000 Ukrainians are going to be eliminated. There's nobody to replace them. And so there's be huge gaps. If Pokrovsk and Kupyansk fall, we're talking about 31 battalions of Ukrainian troops taken out of the order of battle. These are experienced battalions that have been fighting for some time, good command and control, et cetera. They're gone. What are they going to be replaced with? There's no experienced battalions to replace them. So they'll be bringing in, units that have, low morale, poor training, poor unit cohesion. That'll be making mistakes. They'll suffer high casualties. They'll get surrounded. This is the beginning of the end. And everybody said, well, you've been saying that for some time. Well, sometimes it takes a long time to develop. I mean, there's a couple realities that come up. First of all, I was trained to fight war in a very aggressive way. And we had the resources to do this. The Russians have opted to fight a different kind of war, one that doesn't produce Iwo Jima memorials every 5 days, to honor 5,000 to 7,000 dead Marines. They are suffering casualties, but this is high intensity conflict up and down. The Russians have scaled this war in a way that they can absorb their casualties while inflicting maximum casualties on the Ukrainians. To change that algorithm to make it more about capturing territory than killing Ukrainians could be done, but then the Russians would lose more equipment and more manpower. The manpower, I don't think other than the moral factor, Russia can absorb the cash. The equipment, Russia's at war not with Ukraine, but the collective West. And the collective West is providing Ukraine with artillery, armor, everything. So Russia needs to ensure that its rate of loss in terms of equipment is manageable, that they still are able to outproduce the collective West. And we know they are 4-1, 4 times as much production coming out of Russia. So why would you change your algorithm, your tactics, to lower that, to make it 1-to-1, or so that you're losing more equipment than the Ukrainians are? No, the Russians are playing this very smart. It's a game of patience on their part. Sometimes it's frustrating for observers. I can't say it's frustrating for me because I don't have any skin in the game. Would I like this war to be over? Absolutely. Do I think Russia's on the right side of history? Absolutely. But it's not like I've gone to Las Vegas and put $25,000 on Russia taking Pokrovsk by November 7th. So I don't, what Russia does is what Russia does. It's Russia's business. And what Ukraine does is its business. Same thing with NATO. My job is to sit back and try to assess it as objectively as possible. And what I'm seeing right now is that the Russian strategy, which has been criticized in many places, is a sign of weakness. You've seen people like, Gilbert Doctorow and John, I think Roberts is his last name, who are saying that Putin's patience is a sign of weakness. Well, ask the Ukrainians of Pokrovsk how weak they think Vladimir Putin is. Ask the Ukrainians of Kupyansk how weak they think Vladimir Putin is. We also have to be careful that we're being inundated with a flood of anti-Russian propaganda. There is a massive information warfare campaign taking place, more than likely run by the British. It has all the classic earmarks of a British operation, which is sophisticated. And it basically is flooding the market with specific themes that are repeated over and over and over again. And, it's the old adage, if you say something often enough, it sort of gets assumed to be the truth. And so there's a lot of people being confused or, being misdirected by what they're reading on social media platforms or what they're reading in the Telegraph just came out that Vladimir Putin's in a panic. There's going to be a coup, apparently. I mean, my God, there's going to be a coup. And Vladimir Putin is in an absolute panic. Nobody in Russia believes any of this, but apparently the Russian reality doesn't matter. But it matters in Pokrovsk. It matters in Kupyansk. and it matters in the dozen little battles that are taking place where Russia's winning. That's the only reality that matters. You can fool yourself on social media all you want, but at the end of the day, it's just words. It's what's happening on the ground that counts. And my take is that Russia is in the driver's seat. They have the strategic advantage, and they will continue to hold the strategic advantage for some time to come, if not forever.
Yeah, and you see as the media tries so hard, I mean, even just with the latest updates that Russian officials have announced, you've got the reports that come in and they go, oh, well, Zelensky said that's not true. Or, oh, well, anonymous Ukrainian officials said that only 200 Russian troops got into Pokrovsk. And it's like they always have something to say to kind of try to combat the reports that are coming from Russia. And as all of that is happening, you also have, I know President Trump has a comment on everything, saying that Russia needs to focus on ending the war in Ukraine. I would say that they are, as you were noting, in their own way. But Russia is also focused on creating new technology. And you've got Russian officials announcing the test launch of a new unlimited range nuclear powered missile that can evade air defenses, the Burevestnik. Now, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that it's about looking out for Russia's security interest, noting that, quote, ensuring security is a vital issue for Russia, especially against the backdrop of the militaristic sentiment that we are currently hearing primarily from the Europeans. So how do you view the announcement of Russia's new missile and the impact that it could have on the overall world of war, especially as the New START treaty is very close to expiring?
Well, let's just start off by saying that if the Burevestnik is ever used, it doesn't matter. We'll all be dead. It's a nuclear weapon, 1 megaton warhead. The good news is it's not a first strike weapon. It's a weapon of retaliation. And that's why it was developed. People need to go back. Nothing happens in a vacuum, especially in Russia. Everything is linked to something in the past. In 2002, George W. Bush withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. This was one of the foundational arms control agreements reached between the United States and the Soviet Union, signed in 1972 after years of negotiations. And it was the culmination of a joint realization, a mutual realization that if there was a nuclear war, nobody was going to win and everybody was going to die. And therefore, a nuclear war should never be fought. And therefore, it's sort of futile to try and build defenses. Because what was happening is as ballistic missile technologies improved, both Russia and the United States were seeking to build missile interceptors that could shoot down incoming missiles. And as a result, we get advances in technology. We get the Minuteman missile, which is a solid rocket missile. We get the Russians starting to put multiple warheads on missiles. So you have one interceptor coming after a missile. But if I flood the zone with missiles, each one of which has 10 warheads on it, you can't shoot them all down. The warheads are going to flood you. And both sides realize this is getting out of control. This is becoming very dangerous. So we're going to embrace the notion of mutually assured destruction. If we go to nuclear war, we all die. So let's not go to nuclear war. And in order to ensure that we aren't tempted into it, we're not going to defend ourselves. We're going to agree there's no defense. But then after 9/11, first of all, that worked in the 70s. But then when Ronald Reagan came in the 80s, strategic defense initiatives, Star Wars, we thought we were going to build a missile defense shield. And we never could. The technology wasn't there. It was overhyped, oversold. But it always was a dream of the sort of anti-Russian, anti-communist, conservative element of America, the dream of a missile defense. And after 9/11, they were able to turn the threat of so-called rogue states, Iran, North Korea, etc., into justification for us to pull out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, telling the Russians, you don't have anything to worry about, except that one of the first things we do is we develop a ground-based interceptor, base it in Greeley, Alaska, to shoot down, we say North Korean missiles, but it shoots down Russian missiles as well. And the Russians are like, we're not too happy with that. And then we deploy the Mark 41 Aegis ashore in the anti-ballistic missile configuration in Poland and Romania. And the Russians are like, we're not too happy with that. And then we build the Aegis ships to turn them into missile shooters. And so we have a global network. And the Russians are going, we're not too happy with any of this because all you've done is create, at least theoretically, a missile shield when coupled with your ability to bring Trident D5 missiles on Ohio-class submarines close to Russian shores, fire them on a flat trajectory. You can knock out our command and control, knock out much of our force, and any retaliation we have left gets shot down by your missiles, and our strategic nuclear deterrence posture has been eradicated. The Russians warned over and over again, don't do this. Don't do this. This is not smart. In 2010, they signed the New START Treaty, the last remaining arms control vehicle. It expires in February 5th of next year. The treaty's over. They're going to keep the caps in place for another year voluntarily. The caps are important because in the Cold War, each side had around 20, 30,000 nuclear warheads. Now under the caps, it's 1,550. We'd like it to go lower, at least I would. But if this treaty expires and there are no limits, we're going to see it go up. It begin the process that won't stop until we're back to 20, 30, 40,000 deployed strategic nuclear warheads each side, right back where we started, the insanity. And so you've got this treaty vehicle. The Russians negotiated it, but a key aspect of their 2010 negotiating position was to link the treaty with ballistic missile defense. You might remember there was a famous or infamous clip, depending on whose perspective, of Barack Obama and Dmitry Medvedev, who's at that time the president. I think they were in South Korea. And there was a hot mic moment where Medvedev asked about ballistic missile defense, and Barack turned back and said, "You got to give me some time till the next election. After the election, I have a lot more flexibility to work with you." And Medvedev said, "Well, I'll let Putin know." But even before that, the negotiating position of the Russians was always, we have to bring up missile defense. Anatoly Antonov was the lead negotiator for the Russians. Rose Guttemiller was the lead negotiator for the Americans. And Anatoly Antonov said, we need missile defense. Rose came back and said, look, here's the American position. We understand your position on missile defense, but we can't get this treaty through the Senate. We can't get through ratification if there's a rider on it about missile defense. Keep it separate. Let us finish this treaty, and then I promise you we'll get back to missile defense, one of our first agenda items. And Anatoly Antonov went, all right, we trust you. Big mistake, because we got New START in. Anatoly Antonov picks up the phone to Rose and says, hey, when are we starting on missile defense? And she went, no, it's no longer our priority. And that's what prompted Medvedev to turn to Obama saying, what are you doing to me? And Obama said, just give me time. I got these midterm elections. Obama lied. We had no intention of doing ballistic missile defense. 2018, Vladimir Putin does a presentation. You might have seen it live on TV, where he says, we've been telling you, don't do this. Don't do missile defense. Don't move in this direction. But you never listen to us. So let me introduce you to my new friends. Sort of like a scene out of Scarface. Let me introduce you to my little friend. Sarmat, giant ICBM, multiple warheads. But it's not coming at you through the traditional northern polar route. It's coming from the south because it's very long range where you don't have any early warning detection missile defense. It's going to come in and it's going to blow you up and you'll never even know it hit you. Welcome to the world of Sarmat. Poseidon. The Russian new big submarines can launch the Poseidon nuclear torpedo, which can go off and just hang out outside the east coast or west coast of the United States near a big city. And when the time's right, let's say we attacked Russia, it comes up, blows up, and it takes out the entire east coast with a massive tidal wave. Boom. Avant-garde, maneuvering warhead, hypersonic, comes in, you can't shoot it down, hits everything, kills everything. And last but not least was the Burevestnik, which is a nuclear-powered cruise missile with unlimited range. Basically, they can hide it throughout Russia, and if Russia gets attacked, your Burevestnik can take off, and it can come at you any way it wants to. You'll never see it. It's going to kill you. And the Russians may program it to wait a month, 2 months, 3 months. Doesn't matter. It's coming in. It can fly forever. You're not going to shoot it down. Boom. Now, the Burevestnik had some growing pains. These were theoretical weapons. The Sarmat got deployed first in Avant-Garde. Poseidon's out there now. But Burevestnik had a hiccup. If you remember a couple years ago, maybe 2020, or maybe even a little bit after that, there was an accident up north near Arkhangelsk. They were pulling a Burevestnik out of the water, and it blew up, and it killed five scientists, 3 of whom were from Rosatom. And a lot of speculation about how it wasn't going to work, couldn't work. There was a setback, et cetera, et cetera. Putin just said it worked. They flew it. I think it was 14 hours in the air, 15,000 kilometers, and it It's a clean burning engine. It doesn't leave. The Americans kept saying, well, you can't do it because when we tried it, our engine spewed radioactive crap and we decided that it was can't do it. The Russians were like, well, we did it. It's not spewing any radioactive crap. It sort of does its job. It's there. Now, the Russians have said that the missile has passed its test. Now they have to decide how they're going to classify it, how it's going to fit into their nuclear doctrine. And then they have to build units and they have to go into serial production. They have to deploy it. But it's there. So any future arms control treaty now is going to have to bring into account this weapon. And if you want to have the Russians put this under control, what are we getting in return? If that's the Russian perspective. You guys want avant-garde? You don't have the equivalent of that. You want, Poseidon? How do we classify that? You want this? Guys, you're going to have to do something for us. Things you never wanted to do before, like, those B-61 bombs in Europe that are just hanging out there as a NATO, you got to get rid of them. Oh, the French and the British, they don't get to have independent nuclear forces either, not that are linked to NATO. And so the Russians are, for the first time, taking control of the arms control negotiation process. They're setting the kind of terms that we used to set, because there was a time when the Russians had all these systems and we had nothing, and we said we need to capture them all in the interests of arms control, but we linked it to bettering economic relations and things of that nature. And the Russians played ball, especially in the end with Gorbachev. And as you know, today in the as people retrospectively look at history, Gorbachev's come under a lot of criticism for giving away too much, not asking enough. And I think the Russians are saying, we're never going to make that mistake again. We're never going to go to the table and give away the farm. The Russians also recognize that if it weren't for their strategic nuclear deterrence, the war in Ukraine would be a completely different war with major NATO involvement, etc. The only thing that keeps NATO out is Russia saying this conflict is of existential importance to us. We're not going to lose it because nations that are armed with strategic nuclear weapons, they don't lose wars.
Yeah, very, very telling there that, and even as you were laying it out, right, all of the little places where the U.S. and NATO as a whole, they have lied to Russia. They have used the Minsk agreements. They have used even something as simple as a conversation between Obama and Medvedev, and Russia looks at the U.S. and they're like, oh, wait, we really can't trust you, and you're going to use every opportunity to take advantage of us. And I thought it was interesting. You've got BBC News releasing this report citing anonymous officials quoting a new U.S. intelligence assessment, which says that Russian President Putin is, quote, more dug in than ever when it comes to the war in Ukraine and has no interest in compromising to make a deal with. Now, going back to the fact that it's been made clear to Russia that they can't trust NATO and the US in particular, how do you view Russia's current position when it comes to them being in the driver's seat and really just how far they want to go in these tensions with NATO?
Russia has been, again, we come back to the criticism that's put out there by Gilbert Doctorow and John Paul Roberts and others that Putin is weak, by, playing this game along, by not wanting to escalate. While that may be the pragmatic right choice to avoid conflict, it shows Russia is weak, and the West takes advantage of this sign of weakness by, not treating the Russian position with respect, etc. I don't buy into that notion because I actually believe that the Russians are better prepared for topics, and when they make a policy decision, it's not done in a knee-jerk reaction, kumbaya, Vladimir Putin saying, let's hold hands, sing kumbaya, and hope for the best, guys. We're going to come in with goodwill, and we just hope the West shares our will. Amen, brother. No, I think Vladimir Putin lays out all the options and says, well, we don't want a war. We don't want escalation. We are winning. So why don't we continue to win, and yet we'll go forward and say we're ready for negotiations. If they're serious about negotiations, then they'll come back and say, they'll accept our terms and we'll work with it then. But what he found is that the West isn't ever going to accept Russia's terms. That what the West wants is a completely frozen conflict, North-South Korea. They don't care about Ukraine. It's about maintaining some sense of war that tears down the Russian economy, causes the Russia social contract with their government to fray, and even eventually, hopefully, from the Western perspective, bring down Vladimir Putin's government. This is what they want. I think there was people in the Putin government that believed that Donald Trump was different, that he could actually push through NATO, through Congress, everything, a peace plan that would be acceptable to the Russians. And they were willing to give that a try. I think the Russians have come awake, and they now know that the Trump government is incapable of compromise, that they don't want peace, they want victory. What he calls peace is an American victory. They want to permanently weaken Russia. This is the goal. This is the objective. And I think for the first time, the Russians have come in and said, we're done. I mean, I saw something come out of, it's somewhere in the foreign ministry. I don't know if it was from Lavrov or someone else, but, in the past it was the United States saying, we hope that Vladimir Putin, when he comes to the table, it brings a plan capable of, bringing in, we're waiting for the Russians to commit to this. And the Russians came back and said, yeah, there's really no reason for us to meet with Donald Trump unless the Americans are willing to come in with a realistic plan. And until that time, we're not going to meet. It's not in our interest to meet. They've turned they've flipped the script. They're in the driver's seat. And why they're in the driver's seat? Because of Pokrovsk, Kupyansk, and these other realities. The other thing that's not talked about, if you look at the social media, you'll see Russian oil refineries blowing up here, there, and everywhere. And of course, you combine that with the sanction of Lukoil and Rosneft. Suddenly now the sky is falling. The Russian oil economy is collapsing. It's over. Putin's going to have to surrender. Boom, 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 boom. No, actually, Russians will hit their belt a couple notches, tighten it up, but they've got a plan. They're working this through. There is no collapse of the Indian market. There is no collapse of the Chinese market. There is no collapse of the southern global market. Russia will sell oil where, the number of barrels may drop off, but thanks to the sanctions, the price of oil is going up. So it's going to be like a wash for the Russians. So there's this hope that you're going to bring down but the real damage is what Russia is doing to Ukraine on a daily basis. I mean, the Ukrainians are going to be rolling into winter with no electricity anywhere. I mean, there's this Ukrainian parliamentarian who I view as a war criminal, and I believe one day he not only should be arrested, but will be arrested and held accountable. He was in Odessa in May with the group that murdered the 48 Russians. He went around and kicked the bodies of the Russians that jumped out of the burning building to make sure they were dead and mocked them. True Ukrainian nationalist, what. But, he is now saying, Zelensky promised to, turn the lights out in Moscow. Behind me in Kiev is the Hotel Moscow, and the lights are out. Meaning that's the reality of it. All throughout Ukraine, it's over. The Russians have a strategic air campaign that's hitting the energy, and the West is ignoring this aspect of the story, instead focusing on the propaganda aspect of how they're breaking Russia's will to resist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Are they doing harm to Russia? Yeah. Does it cause pain? Yep. Can Russia adjust? Yeah, they are. And will Russia win? Yes. Ukraine, on the other hand, is being wiped off the map in terms of its ability to sustain itself as a civilized state. And I think we're going to be just seeing a different winter and a different vibe coming out of Ukraine. I think the will to resist is going to be diminished greatly rolling into next year.
Yeah, it's very telling as you're watching all of this play out. And exactly as you're noting there, Russia is adapting, yet NATO doesn't seem to be, right? NATO seems to be going on with the exact same plan with no actual real backup plan, just thinking, oh, Kiev will hold on. Well, that's all fine and good until they're not able to hold on anymore.
There's 2,000 French troops getting ready to deploy. That ignores the fact that every day Ukraine loses 2,300, 3,000 troops. So the French are willing to provide enough troops to survive less than a day in combat against the Russians. I mean, that's NATO in a nutshell.
Germany's defense minister declaring that this winter will be crucial for Kiev. And I'm like, okay, I see the headline. What's under that? Well, the EU needs to get on it with using frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. That's their answer. Like, there's no, oh, we're going to, we have this concrete plan to ramp up production here, or, oh, we have the troops right beyond just 2,500 to actually change the balance of power on the battlefield. The last thing I'll throw in there, when it comes to NATO, how do you see how long they're willing to stay in this at this pace?
Well, I mean, NATO is, of course, an alliance of, what are they, up to 30 some odd members now? It's not a question of how long is the organization willing to stay in. It's how long are the individual members of this organization able to sustain this. Right now, you have, these NATO countries are almost exclusively, there are some exceptions, governed by political and economic elites that have bought into this notion of, a viable European Union capable of standing on its own 2 feet, and the imperative of this transatlantic alliance that, backs this European Union strength up to the hilt. In order to sustain all that in a post-Cold War environment, you have to have an enemy, and that enemy is Russia. And so they've postured Russia to be the enemy. They've created conflict in Ukraine to push that along. They never expected Russia to be able to do what it's doing. They honestly thought that Russia would fold like a house of cards after the sanctioning that took place in 2022. They never expected that Russia would be able to sustain this fight economically or militarily, and therefore this would bring about the political collapse of Vladimir Putin, which this is all about. If you go to Vegas, you'll see some guys come in. They have a strategy. They go to a table and they've got a limit. And if they're gambling and they reach their limit, they walk. They cut their losses. They say, well, that's it. I've got to regroup and reapproach this. Then you see the idiots that come in and they just keep going in. Then they go empty out their credit cards and they go do the mortgage. And next thing you know, they've lost they're in. And they have no choice. They're at the table. They're committed to the game. They've mortgaged their children's future, their wives' future, their family's future. And it's all riding on this last roll of the dice. And they're just there. That's NATO. They've mortgaged everything to commit to this course of action. And they're playing against the house. And the odds are stacked against it. The Russians aren't playing. The Russians are playing with dice that are loaded in favor of the house. Russians are playing with cards marked that only the house can read. There's a roulette table where they're pumping the ball and it goes where they want it to go. The bottom line is NATO can't win. And that's the reality. And one by one, you're going to start to see these NATO countries fold and go away. Macron is hanging on by a hair. I don't think they're going to get this budget passed that he wants to be passed. He's already made, compromises on pensions, but it's a temporary compromise. They're delaying it for a year, but Macron's never going to renege on that. The bottom line is Macron is unsustainable as the president of France. And when he goes, the likelihood is he can be replaced by a far right-wing party of Marine Le Pen, Marine Le Pen is going to say, we're not in favor of this war. Keir Starmer is going to get the thumb. And when he does, the new British government will probably say, we can't afford this war. We got to focus on the thing. Germany, Merz, they just stood up a brigade in Lithuania. Think about that for a moment. The Germans stood up a brigade in Lithuania, and nobody's going, what? The 45th Brigade. These guys are awesome. They're Germans. They can't fight. They don't have any equipment, but they're there with a evening tattoo, with garbage cans that have been carved in precise German fashion to show the unit symbol as they line up with their berets, and they look so violent and all this. It's a joke, but even the German government that's promoting this joke, they're not going to survive. They can't afford pens. Basically, these political and economic elites are asking the European people to give up everything so that they can continue this fight in Ukraine that makes no sense for them. And so what I think we're going to see is that NATO is just going to become a vehicle that's unsustainable, and one by one, nations are going to start to opt out. And when that happens, it'll become a cascade, and that'll be the end of NATO.
Yeah, it's very telling. This is the fight that they chose, and yet Russia on its end said, okay, you guys wanted this fight, and they have responded to it at every turn. There's certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much.